He showed up in his best suit, cane polished, heart full of pride, ready to watch his grandson graduate. But when the school told 78-year-old James Whitaker there was no room inside, they sat him outside, like an afterthought. What no one expected was that James carried something far more powerful than applause. A letter written in shaking hands that would change his grandson's life forever. This isn't just a story about a graduation. It's about dignity, sacrifice, and the kind of love that refuses to be silenced. Would you have done what James did? The morning sun had barely cleared the horizon when James Whitaker stood in front of his bedroom mirror, tugging at the knot of his tie. He had tied thousands of them in his 78 years' funerals, weddings, job interviews, Sunday mornings, but this one trembled slightly in his hands. He steadied himself, took a slow breath, and smoothed the navy silk down the front of his crisp white shirt. Today was not just another ceremony. Today his grandson would cross a stage, diploma in hand, stepping into the kind of future James had always prayed for. On the bed behind him lay a neatly folded jacket, pressed the night before with careful precision, and his polished black shoes, shining like onyx in the morning light. He had worked an extra half hour on those shoes, even though his knees ached and his back stiffened every time he bent over. His daughter, Anne, had told him no one would notice from the bleachers. But James noticed. And to him, a man's shoes said as much about him as his words ever could. Leaning against the dresser was his canna slender piece of wood, darkened by decades of handling. It had belonged to his father, a man who had walked with quiet dignity long after his legs had begun to betray him. James had inherited the cane the year he turned 60, more symbol than necessity back then. Now it was his steadying companion, the one thing that gave him both balance and memory. Running his hand along its smooth handle, James felt as though he was carrying not just wood, but legacy. His father had used it to walk proudly into James's own graduation, almost 6 decades earlier. Now it was James's turn. He shrugged into the jacket and stood a little straighter. His reflection stared back at him, the silver hair combed carefully to the side, the lines of his face softened by time, but hardened at the edges with endurance. He looked, he thought, not like an old man about to watch a ceremony, but like a soldier reporting for duty. Downstairs, the kitchen clock ticked loudly, reminding him not to linger. He slipped an envelope into his jacket pocket, a habit he had carried for years. Inside was a simple card that read, "For Ethan, on your graduation day. Love, Grandpa." He had written it 2 weeks earlier, unsure of what words would matter most, but certain that his grandson deserved something permanent, something he could hold when life grew unsteady. The house felt too quiet as James locked the door behind him. Once, it had echoed with the voices of his children, with laughter spilling down the stairs and the smell of Sunday roasts filling the air. Now it was just him, the cane tapping against the porch steps as he descended carefully. Outside, the world looked alive with spring. The grass shimmered with dew, and the dogwood trees that lined the street bent gently in the morning breeze. James eased himself into his car, the leather seat creaking beneath him. He checked the passenger seat one last time, making sure the gift bag was still there. Modest watch he had saved up to buy for Ethan. Nothing extravagant, but something that carried meaning. A reminder that time is the one gift you can't buy back. As he drove through the streets of town, memories flooded him. He recalled taking Ethan fishing at Lake Pines when the boy was barely 7. His small hands clumsy with a rod, but his grin wide with triumph when he caught his first perch. He thought of the countless baseball games, the piano recitals, the birthdays marked with balloons and store-bought cakes. He had tried never to miss a moment, not because he had to, but because he knew too well how fleeting those moments were. Traffic thickened as he neared the high school, families streaming toward the same destination, their cars packed with balloons, flowers, and proud voices. James parked farther than he wanted, the walk ahead longer than his knees liked, but he refused to ask for help. This was a day for pride, not pity. He took his cane in hand, stepped carefully onto the sidewalk, and began the slow journey toward the gymnasium. Each tap of the cane felt like a drumbeat carrying him closer. Each step a reminder that even in the twilight of life, some milestones shone brighter than the aches of age. As the building came into view, draped with banners that read "Congratulations, Class of 2025, James felt a surge of warmth rise in his chest. His heart swelled, not with his own accomplishments, but with the thought that his grandson was about to step into the world armed with a diploma, a dream, and, if James had done his job right, a sense of family that would steady him in the storms ahead. He paused at the steps of the school, resting on his cane, letting the sound of laughter and chatter wash over him. This was it, the day he had been waiting for, the moment he had envisioned every time he thought of the boy he had cradled in his arms 2 decades earlier. Adjusting his jacket, smoothing his tie, and lifting his chin, James Whitaker walked forward into the building, carrying with him not just the weight of his years, but the immeasurable pride of a grandfather about to witness his grandson's new beginning. The parking lot stretched wide before the high school, lined with sedans, SUVs, and the occasional pickup truck carrying banners and balloons. Parents hurried across the asphalt, arms filled with flowers, cameras slung around their necks. The air buzzed with anticipation, the kind that clings to events where milestones are measured, where futures are glimpsed in caps and gowns. James Whitaker stepped carefully from his car, the weight of his cane balanced in his hand, his polished shoes catching the sunlight as though they knew this day mattered. He paused for a moment, leaning lightly against the cane, and let himself absorb the scene. The school hadn't changed much in decades. Brick walls baked red by Georgia's sun, tall windows that caught the morning light, banners in the school's blue and gold colors draped proudly from the facade. To the students, it was just a backdrop for an ending. To James, it was a stage 4 beginnings, one more chapter in a family story that stretched further back than his own memory could hold. The faint sound of a brass band floated through the air, warming up inside the gymnasium. A trombone slid lazily through a scale, the snare drum rumbled, the trumpet cracked and then steadied. The music mingled with the chatter of arriving families, producing a kind of symphony that was less about pitch and rhythm and more about life itself. James smiled faintly. He had marched to music once, many years ago, but those songs had been sterner, louder, meant to command attention. This music was softer, but its purpose, no less important, carried young men and women toward their futures. He began the walk toward the school entrance, each step steady, deliberate. The cane clicked against the sidewalk in a rhythm that matched the thrum of his heartbeat. Around him, parents bustled quickly, sometimes brushing past without so much as a glance. He didn't mind. He wasn't here to be seen. He was here to see, to witness his grandson, Ethan, walk across that stage and receive a diploma that carried both promise and history. At the edge of the lawn, a group of students posed for pictures, their gowns flowing in the morning breeze, tassels swinging with every laugh. One young man adjusted his mortarboard as his mother fussed with the angle of his tie. Another student spun around playfully, nearly tripping over her gown, and the entire group burst into laughter. James lingered just long enough to smile. Youth had its own music, he thought, one that could fill a room without a single instrument. Near the gym doors, volunteers directed the crowd, checking invitations and guiding families to their seats. James adjusted his jacket, feeling the envelope in his inside pocket pressed gently against his chest. He thought of Ethan again, remembering the boy as a child, running barefoot across the yard, hair wild, eyes bright with mischief and wonder. To see him now, standing tall in his cap and gown, would be a kind of miracle, proof that time, despite its cruelty, could also be kind. The hum of conversation thickened as James drew closer to the doors. He could hear the squeak of sneakers against the polished gym floor inside, the rustle of folding chairs as they filled. A sense of pride welled inside him, so strong it nearly buckled his knees. He gripped the cane tighter, steadied himself, and whispered a quiet prayer. Not for himself, but for Ethan, for his journey ahead, for his ability to carry forward the lessons of kindness and integrity that his family had always tried to instill. He reached the steps and paused again, catching his breath. The banners above the entrance shimmered slightly in the breeze. Congratulations, class of 2025. Simple words, yet they carried the weight of futures unknown. James adjusted his tie once more, straightened his jacket, and stepped forward into the current of families streaming inside. The gymnasium doors stood wide, and from within spilled the smell of fresh floor polish, the buzz of excited voices, and the sound of the band striking up a familiar tune. Pomp and circumstance. The melody curled through the air, dignified and eternal, a song James had walked to himself all those years ago. The corners of his eyes prickled with memory. As he approached the doorway, his heart lifted. This was the threshold, the point at which a grandfather's years of sacrifice and love met a grandson's moment of triumph. James allowed himself a brief smile, soft and full of pride. Whatever else the day might bring, this moment was his forever into the story of his life. He tightened his grip on the cane, lifted his chin, and walked toward the doors. The world inside was waiting, and with it, the sight he had longed for. Ethan Whitaker, his grandson, crossing a stage into the future. The line at the gymnasium entrance curled like a slow-moving river. Parents and grandparents inching forward with tickets in hand. The air smelled faintly of cologne, fresh-cut flowers, and nervous anticipation. James Whitaker tightened his grip on his cane and shuffled forward with the rest, the murmur of voices swelling around him. He could hear the echo of the band inside now, not yet in full song, but rehearsing the march that would carry the graduates to their seats. Ahead, a pair of young ushers in matching polo shirts stood beside a rope barrier. They held clipboards and wore the kind of polite but firm expressions that said they had been told their job mattered. Each guest handed over an envelope or a ticket. Each usher scanned, nodded, and waved them inside. The process seemed smooth, efficient, till James reached the front. He pulled the invitation from his jacket pocket, the one his daughter had mailed weeks ago, with a note that read, "Dad, this will get you in. Make sure you're early." He had been early, nearly an hour before the ceremony, certain he would have time to find a good seat, maybe near the aisle where he could see Ethan clearly. "Name, sir?" one usher asked, his eyes flicking briefly from the clipboard to James's face. "Whitaker, James Whitaker. I'm here for my grandson, Ethan," James replied, voice steady, tinged with the pride he couldn't quite hide. The usher scanned the list, then frowned slightly. "You do have an invitation?" "Yes," James said, offering the envelope. The usher took it, compared it against his list, then handed it back with a small, practiced smile that carried more pity than kindness. "I'm sorry, sir. The gymnasium is at capacity. Fire code, you understand. We have overflow seating set up just outside. Big screen, live feed. You won't miss anything." For a moment, James thought he had misheard. He blinked, shifting his weight on the cane. "Outside?" he asked quietly. "Yes, sir. Just across the courtyard. We've set up chairs and speakers. You'll be able to see the whole thing." James's jaw tightened. He could hear the crowd shuffling behind him, restless, eager to move forward. He stepped aside, letting another family pass, but he didn't move toward the courtyard. "I was invited," he said again, more to himself than to the usher. "I'm his grandfather." The second usher, a girl with a braid down her back, leaned forward, voice hushed as though offering comfort. "I know it's disappointing, sir, but we have to follow the rules. Only so many people are allowed inside." James glanced past them, through the open gym doors. He could see rows of folding chairs filled with families, mothers clutching bouquets, fathers holding camcorders aloft. The air inside looked bright, almost holy, with the glow of fluorescent lights reflecting off polished floors. That was where he belonged, not because he demanded it, but because he had earned it through decades of love, through sacrifices quietly made so that his daughter could raise Ethan without ever doubting if she had support. He cleared his throat. "I walked a long way to be here. My knees don't handle heat well. I came early. There must be some room left." The ushers exchanged a glance. The boy's voice hardened. "I'm sorry, sir. If we let one more person in, we have to let 10. That's not fair to the others waiting outside." James swallowed the frustration burning in his chest. He wasn't an angry man, never had been. Life had taught him patience, humility. But this cut deep. To sit outside while his grandson's moment unfolded inside. To hear muffled applause instead of being part of it. It felt like exile. A woman behind him touched his shoulder gently. "I think they've got water outside, sir. It won't be so bad." She meant well, but her words only deepened the ache. James nodded faintly, more out of courtesy than agreement. He adjusted his jacket, straightened his tie, and stepped away from the line. The cane tapped against the pavement. Steady, deliberate, each step carried the weight of disappointment, but also the stubborn dignity of a man who refused to beg. The courtyard stretched out beside the gym. Rows of metal folding chairs arranged under a canopy. A large screen flickered at the front, the picture grainy, the speakers hissing with feedback. Parents already seated fanned themselves with programs, shielding their eyes from the sun. The sound of laughter and applause drifted from the gym, muffled by brick walls, and James felt the sharp edge of separation cut through him. He lowered himself onto a chair in the front row of the overflow section, his cane resting across his lap. The invitation slipped from his fingers and landed on the ground. For a long moment, he stared at it, the paper crumpled at the edges. The words "Class of 2025" printed boldly across the front. He reached down slowly, picked it up, and tucked it back into his pocket, as though refusing to let it be discarded so easily. He sat back, shoulders squared, eyes fixed on the flickering screen. His grandson would walk across that stage, diploma in hand, and James would be there even if the world had pushed him outside. But deep inside, a quiet thought stirred. Perhaps this moment wasn't just about Ethan's graduation. Perhaps it was also about the lesson life was whispering to him, that dignity sometimes means enduring exile, but never letting it erase your presence. And with that thought, James tightened his grip on the cane, lifted his chin, and prepared to watch from the margins, determined that his love would not be diminished by a door that had closed. James Whitaker sat in the overflow section for several long minutes, the cane balanced across his lap, his polished shoes planted firmly on the hot pavement. The folding chair beneath him wobbled each time someone shifted in the row behind him, and the speakers crackled with static before the band's rehearsal filtered faintly through. He could almost pretend he was part of the ceremony if he squinted hard enough at the flickering screen, but deep inside, he knew he wasn't. He wasn't in there. He wasn't where his grandson could see him, where his cheers could rise with the rest. The thought gnawed at him until he felt something stir, a quiet fire he hadn't expected at his age. James wasn't a man prone to anger, but he had never been one to surrender dignity, either. He had fought too hard, worked too many nights, carried too many burdens for his family to simply vanish into the shadows when it mattered most. He leaned forward on the cane, pressed his palm against the wood, and rose slowly from the chair. His knees wobbled, but his resolve did not. He walked back toward the gymnasium doors, each step deliberate. The ushers saw him coming, their polite smiles already tightening, bracing for his return. Parents glanced his way as they streamed inside, a few curious, others sympathetic. To them, he was just another old man, trying to bend the rules. But James knew the truth. He wasn't asking for privilege. He was asking for presence. At the rope barrier, he paused, lifting the invitation from his jacket pocket once more. He held it carefully, as though the paper itself carried the weight of his family's history. "Son," he said quietly to the usher with the clipboard, "I need you to listen to me." The boy hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, sir." "I fought in a war before you were born," James began, his voice steady, but edged with the gravel of memory. "I worked 3 decades in a factory to put my children through school. I buried my wife before she could see her grandson walk across this very stage. Today, I came early, ticket in hand, because all I've ever wanted is to be there for him. Not outside, not on a broken speaker. Inside, where I can see his face when he hears his name called." The usher's eyes flickered with discomfort. He shifted from one foot to the other, then glanced at his partner. The girl with the braid looked down, as though unable to meet James's gaze. "I'm sorry," the boy said, his voice softer now. "I don't make the rules. We're at capacity. I can't let anyone else in." James tightened his grip on the cane, the wood creaking faintly under his hand. "Capacity," he repeated. "Do you know what capacity means to me? It means a life full of sacrifices, every dollar stretched, every promise kept so that my grandson could stand where he is today. And now, after 78 years, you're telling me my love doesn't fit inside that room." A hush rippled across the small crowd waiting to enter. One man in a ball cap muttered, "Let him in, for heaven's sake." A woman near the back added, "He's a grandfather. That should count for something." But the usher shook his head again, eyes apologetic yet firm. "If I open this rope for you, sir, I'll have a dozen others demanding the same. Please understand." James closed his eyes briefly, exhaling through his nose. The fire in him wanted to shout, to push past the rope and demand his seat. But he wasn't a man of shouting. He was a man of quiet protests, the kind that lingered long after the noise has faded. When he opened his eyes again, they glistened, not with defeat, but with conviction. "Then I want you to know," he said evenly, "that when my grandson walks that stage, he won't hear my voice inside, but he'll feel my pride outside. And that matters more than any rule in your clipboard." The usher swallowed, unable to reply. James turned slowly, shoulders straight despite the weight pressing on them, and walked back toward the courtyard. Behind him, murmurs followed, some admiring, some regretful, but James didn't look back. He returned to the folding chair, lowered himself carefully, and set the cane across his lap once more. The screen flickered again, showing a sea of caps and gowns filing into the gymnasium. James's chest ached, but not from age. From love, from frustration, from the raw sting of exclusion. Still, he sat tall, his presence unshaken. He would not shout, he would not beg, he would not crumble. His protest was quieter, deeper. He would endure, And when the time came, his grandson would know. Because James Whitaker had never once walked away from his family, and he wasn't about to start now. The folding chair creaked under James Whitaker's weight as he lowered himself once again into the front row of the overflow section. The canopy above did little to soften the sun, and the metal frame of the chair radiated heat through his suit pants. He adjusted his tie, loosened it slightly, then straightened his back. He had endured harsher conditions in his lifelong shifts on factory floors, winters with broken heaters, even humid summers spent repairing roofs after storms, but this discomfort struck him differently. This wasn't just about heat or age. This was about distance. The big screen flickered, fighting the glare of daylight. The image was washed out, the colors pale, the edges blurred. Faces were indistinguishable, just a tide of black gowns and square caps moving in rhythm to the band's march. James leaned forward, squinting, straining to pick out the familiar figure of his grandson. His cane balanced across his lap, his fingers tapping lightly against it, the only outward sign of the storm brewing inside him. Around him, other families shifted restlessly in their chairs. Some muttered complaints about the poor sound quality. Others fanned themselves with folded programs. One woman sighed, "You can barely hear a thing," as the speakers hissed and popped. A man in sunglasses grumbled, "We should have just stayed home and watched the light." Their words buzzed in James's ears, but he didn't respond. He wasn't here for screens or sound. He was here for Ethan. He fixed his eyes on the blurry shapes on the screen, reminding himself that presence wasn't measured by proximity. His grandson didn't need to see him in the bleachers to know he had come. Ethan would know, because James had always been there, at every milestone, every birthday, every small victory. That was the kind of faithfulness that no locked door could erase. Still, the ache gnawed at him. He thought of his late wife, Margaret, and how she would have fought harder than he did at the checkpoint. She had been a gentle woman, but when it came to her family, she was iron. James pictured her standing tall at those gym doors, chin lifted, daring anyone to stop her from witnessing her grandson's triumph. He smiled faintly at the thought. She had always been the fire to his quiet endurance. Inside, the ceremony roared to life. Applause rolled through the walls, muffled but unmistakable. James felt it vibrate faintly under his feet, as though the ground itself carried echoes of the celebration he had been denied. He closed his eyes for a moment, listening. Each cheer struck him like a wave, both painful and beautiful. He imagined Ethan's name being called, his grandson's long stride across the stage, the firm shake of the principal's hand, the flash of a smile as he accepted his diploma. James could almost see it, though the image came from memory more than the screen. The usher from earlier passed by, carrying a bottle of water toward the courtyard. He paused briefly near James, offering it wordlessly. James accepted with a nod, unscrewed the cap, and took a slow sip. The water was lukewarm, but it eased the tightness in his throat. "Thank you," he murmured. The usher gave a small nod, before hurrying away, perhaps ashamed, perhaps relieved. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. The sun climbed higher, baking the courtyard in gold. James's suit clung to his shoulders, his collar damp with sweat. Yet he refused to loosen it further. This was Ethan's day, and appearances mattered, even if no one inside could see him. He would not greet his grandson later looking anything less than proud. At one point, a little girl tugged on her mother's sleeve, in the row behind James. "Why can't he go inside?" she asked, pointing to him. The mother hushed her, whispering, "Not enough room, sweetie." But the child persisted. "He's all dressed up. He should be in there." James turned slightly, offered the girl a gentle smile, and tapped his cane softly against the ground in a playful rhythm. She giggled, and for a fleeting second, the sting of exile lessened. Still, when the screen cut briefly to static before regaining its picture, James felt a pang so sharp it caught in his chest. He wasn't really watching his grandson graduate. He was watching shadows, outlines, approximations of the moment. The real thing, the warmth of the gym, the swell of the crowd. The sight of Ethan's proud smile was locked away behind walls he could not pass. Yet even in that exile, James made a choice. He straightened once more, lifted his chin, and whispered into the heavy air, "I'm here, Ethan, I'm with you." The words disappeared into the noise of the speakers, unheard by anyone else. But he believed, deep in his bones, that somehow, his grandson would feel them. The ceremony pressed on, the sun marched higher, and James sat firm in his chair, exiled but unbroken. He knew he could not change where he was forced to sit, but he could decide how he carried himself while sitting there, and so, he carried himself with dignity. quiet, steadfast, a grandfather's love refusing to be diminished, even by the sting of being left outside. The ceremony droned on through the crackling speakers, names being called one after another, applause surging in muffled waves from inside the gym. James Whitaker sat beneath the canopy, the weight of the moment pressing against his chest. The screen flickered again, showing a blur of students in black gowns, moving toward their seats. For a time, he focused on it, but soon his gaze drifted to the distance, to the patch of blue sky peeking through the canopy's edge. It was in that piece of sky that memory stirred. The day of his own graduation returned, vivid and sharp despite the 6 decades that had passed. June of 1965. The world was different then, yet the same in ways that mattered. His parents had come early, just as he had today. He remembered his mother's floral dress, the scent of lavender that clung to her like a signature, and his father tall, serious, but with eyes that softened when they landed on his son. That day, his father had walked with the same cane James now carried, though back then it was less for necessity and more for style, a mark of his quiet authority. The gym at his school had been stifling hot, the air thick with humidity and anticipation. He remembered the way his tassel tickled his cheek as he walked, the way the wooden floor creaked under the weight of 100 graduates moving in step. But most of all, he remembered looking up from his seat, scanning the crowd until his eyes found his parents. They had been seated front and center, his father's broad shoulders squared, his mother's hands clasped tightly in her lap. When his name was called, they both rose to their feet, clapping so loudly he could hear them above all the others. That sound had carried him across the stage, stronger than any drumbeat. Afterward, as the crowd spilled into the warm evening air, his father placed a hand on his shoulder. It was not a gentle pat or a fleeting touch. It was firm, grounding. "Make your life count," he had said, the words simple, heavy, eternal. At 18, James hadn't fully understood. He had thought it meant working hard, paying bills, keeping his head down. But as the years unspooled marriage, children, long nights on the factory floor, he came to realize his father had meant something more. To live with purpose. To stand for something. To give of yourself so that others could walk a little easier. Now, sitting outside a graduation he had been barred from attending, those words returned to him with aching clarity. Make your life count. Was this part of what his father had meant? To accept indignities quietly, with grace, because family was worth more than personal pride? Or had he misunderstood? Should he have fought harder at the checkpoint, raised his voice, demanded his rightful place? He let out a slow breath, eyes narrowing at the screen. He imagined Ethan walking that stage, strong, confident, unaware that his grandfather sat in exile only a few yards away. But perhaps that was as it should be. Ethan didn't need to see the struggle to feel the love behind it. Perhaps the lesson would come later, in its own time. The thought soothed him, if only slightly. James leaned back, resting both hands on the cane. The wood was warm from the sun, smooth beneath his palms. He traced the grooves carved by his father's grip, a legacy passed from hand to hand, generation to generation. It struck him then that this cane had witnessed to graduations his own, and now Ethan's. Even if only from the courtyard dot around him. The overflow crowd shifted again, restless in the heat. Someone muttered about leaving early. Another family argued quietly about dinner plans. But James remained still, anchored by memory. He pictured his father's stern face, softening into pride. Heard the echo of his mother's applause. Felt again the weight of that hand on his shoulder. Make your life count. Perhaps his life's meaning wasn't in where he sat, but in what he carried, his steadfast presence. His refusal to abandon moments, even when pushed aside. Perhaps Ethan would one day remember not that his grandfather sat outside, but that he came at all, dressed in his best suit, shoes shining, eyes full of love. The thought brought a faint smile to James's lips. He looked back at the screen, still flickering, still unreliable, but it didn't matter. In his mind, the picture was clear. A boy walking forward, a man watching with pride, and the invisible thread binding them across years, across generations. James closed his eyes briefly, letting the applause from inside wash over him like a tide. For the first time since being turned away, he felt the sting ease, replaced by something quieter, steadier. Not defeat, not bitterness, reflection. The kind his father might have called wisdom. And when he opened his eyes again, he whispered into the warm air, "I'm making it count, Dad. I'm making it count." The applause inside the gymnasium rose again, muffled but unmistakable, swelling like thunder contained within brick walls. James Whitaker sat rigid in his folding chair beneath the canopy, cane across his lap, his polished shoes firmly planted against the warm pavement. He could feel the vibrations of celebration through the soles of those shoes. Faint ripples of energy carried outward from the place he longed to be. The screen at the front of the overflow section wavered. The image, washed out by sunlight and grainy, was static. Students in their caps and gowns shuffled into rows, tassels swinging, faces blurred beyond recognition. Every so often, the camera panned across the crowd inside, capturing parents who leaned forward eagerly, their eyes wide with joy, their applause loud enough to shake the gym. James squinted, straining to pick out Ethan in the sea of identical gowns. His heart leaped at every tall figure, but the camera shifted too quickly, and each time the moment slipped away. It was then the ache set in, not physical, though his knees did throb from sitting too long. It was the ache of separation, of knowing that even though he was close enough to hear the echoes, he was still on the outside looking in. A grandfather exiled to the courtyard, watching his grandson's triumph through a veil of static and distance. He shifted in his seat, loosening his tie just enough to draw a deeper breath. His eyes wandered to the family seated beside him. A young mother balanced a toddler on her lap, bouncing him gently while keeping one eye on the screen. The child laughed, oblivious to the occasion, more interested in the fluttering tassels than the ceremony itself. Behind James, two older women whispered about the heat, fanning themselves with folded programs, their words carrying easily in the heavy air. None of them seemed as bothered by the separation as he was. They had resigned themselves to it, accepting the overflow as the price of late arrivals or too small gymnasiums. But for James, it wasn't so simple. This wasn't just another graduation. This was his grandson, the boy he had rocked to sleep while his daughter worked double shifts. The boy he had taught to ride a bike in the cracked driveway. The boy whose small hand had once clung tightly to his own. Every memory rose now, sharp and insistent, reminding him that he had walked every step of Ethan's journey to this day. And yet, at the moment of culmination, he sat separated by walls, glass, and static. Inside, the principal's voice carried faintly through the speakers, words distorted but formal. James caught phrases: bright futures, remarkable achievements, resilient spirit. The crowd roared again, and James's chest tightened. He imagined Ethan sitting tall, his cap slightly crooked, his eyes darting toward the audience, in search of familiar faces. Would he notice his grandfather wasn't there? Would his heart falter, even for a second, when he didn't spot him among the crowd? The thought was unbearable. James gripped the cane tighter, knuckles whitening against the smooth wood. He wanted to stand, to march back to those gym doors, to demand entry not for himself, but for the bond between them. But he stayed rooted, weighed down by both pride and pain. As the ceremony rolled on, James's separation deepened. He wasn't only apart from Ethan, he was apart from the entire experience. The sound of the band, the echo of feet across the stage, the smell of polished wood and fresh flowers, those details belonged to the people inside. Out here, there was only heat, static, and the distant hum of what should have been his. The ache shifted then, taking on a different shape. It wasn't just disappointment, it was loneliness. Surrounded by dozens of others in the overflow section, James still felt singularly alone. Each family had their own graduate to watch, their own story, their own connection. But his connection, his bond with Ethan, felt severed, stretched thin across walls and wires. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and whispered into the open air, "I'm here, Ethan. Even if you can't see me, I'm here." The words disappeared instantly into the noise of restless children and squeaky chairs. But speaking them gave him strength. The ceremony inside pressed on, laughter and applause seeping through the gym's thick walls like sunlight through blinds. James sat straighter, his heart heavy yet unyielding. Separation had pushed him outside, but it would not silence his pride. His love for his grandson was not confined to bleachers or walls. It was larger than the gymnasium, larger than the ceremony, large enough to span any distance. Still, as the crowd inside cheered again, James felt the sting sharpen, and he understood this separation would mark him forever. It wasn't the kind of hurt that faded with time. It was the kind that etched itself into memory, carried alongside pride like a scar worn quietly beneath the suit jacket. And in that moment, he promised himself, if he could not be seen today, then he would make sure he was remembered tomorrow. George's sun climbed higher, pouring through the gaps in the canopy until beads of sweat formed along James Whitaker's temples. He dabbed at his brow with a handkerchief, folded it neatly, and tucked it back into his jacket pocket. Around him, the overflow crowd fidgeted in the heat. Programs were waved like fans, water bottles emptied, chairs scraped against the pavement. A restless chorus of sighs rose and fell, but James remained still, his cane balanced across his lap, his eyes fixed on the flickering screen. It was during one of the longer speech's blurred words, carried faintly through the static, that James felt the weight of the day pressed deeper into his chest. Not the disappointment of being outside, not the sting of separation, but something heavier, something final. He shifted in his seat, aware of the stiffness in his knees, the dull ache that had been his companion for years. His breath came slower than it once had, shallow at times, as though the air itself resisted him. He realized, sitting there in the heat with the muffled echoes of applause rattling the canopy, that this might be his last graduation. He would not likely live to see Ethan's children cross their own stages. He might not even see his grandson's college ceremony, if age continued its steady march. The thought struck him with the force of a hammer. This was not just another milestone. This was the milestone. The one he had fought to be present for. The one he could not afford to miss. And yet, here he sat, relegated to the outside, as though his years of sacrifice had counted for nothing. His throat tightened, but not from heat. It was grief, sudden and sharp, for all the moments he might not have left, for the advice he would never give, the dinners he would miss, the stories he had not yet told. He imagined Ethan one day standing at another threshold, diploma in hand, and turning to find only absence where his grandfather should have been. The realization pulled him inward, back through the long corridors of memory. Nights spent working overtime while Anne studied for her nursing degree. Weekends when Ethan, no older than 6, would climb into his lap with a book, demanding story after story until they both nodded off in the recliner. The countless baseball games, piano recitals, spelling bees, all the ordinary milestones that had felt extraordinary simply because they had shared them. He had always been there, always. And the idea that this day, this crowning moment of his grandson's youth would be remembered without him cut deeper than any wound age had given him. On the screen, the camera zoomed in on the rows of students. James squinted, heart leaping again, but the image was grainy, faces indistinguishable. Still, he imagined Ethan sitting tall, adjusting the sleeves of his gown, glancing out into the crowd in search of someone. In search of him. James's chest ached at the thought that Ethan might not find him there, that he might assume his grandfather had chosen absence rather than being forced into it. He pressed his palm flat against the cane, grounding himself. "I'm here, boy," he whispered into the heavy air. "Don't you ever think I wasn't here." The words were swallowed by the chatter around him, but saying them eased the pressure inside. Just slightly. The realization deepened, carrying with it a strange clarity. This ceremony wasn't just about watching Ethan receive a diploma. It was about bearing witness, about leaving behind proof that he had been part of the journey. The truth of his age, his frailty, his dwindling years, none of it mattered, as long as Ethan carried forward the memory of a grandfather who never stopped showing up. Even when forced to sit outside, James closed his eyes briefly, letting the muffled applause wash over him. He felt the separation still, sharp and undeniable, but he also felt a shift. If the world insisted on keeping him outside, then he would leave something behind that reached inside. Something Ethan would never forget. When he opened his eyes again, his gaze settled on the envelope tucked in his jacket pocket. His fingers brushed against it, and he knew. The words written inside might carry further than his presence ever could. The realization brought with it a quiet strength. He could not control the seat he had been given, but he could control the legacy he left in it. And with that thought, James sat taller. His shoulders squared against the heat, his mind already moving toward what must come next. The sun had edged toward noon, its light pouring relentlessly across the courtyard, baking the pavement until it shimmered. James Whitaker sat upright in his chair, his back stiff against the heat, the handkerchief damp now from wiping his brow. Around him, families shifted uncomfortably, a few already drifting away, muttering about watching the rest of the ceremony from home. James, however, could not leave. His heart tethered him to this spot, close enough to feel the vibrations of applause from inside. Too far to join them. His hand drifted toward his jacket pocket, brushing against the folded envelope he had placed there weeks ago. At first, it had been nothing more than a precaution in old man's sentimentality, he told himself. Something to leave behind if he grew too weak to attend, or if the unexpected struck. But now, the paper pressed against his chest like a heartbeat, insistent, reminding him of what he had already known in his bones. This day might not go as planned, but his love for his grandson could still find a way through. He thought again of the words he had scribbled late one night. Sitting at the kitchen table, the house silent except for the creak of the old clock above the fridge. For Ethan, on your graduation day. Love, Grandpa. He had written more, of course, lessons, fragments of the wisdom that only years could carve. But at the time, he had felt foolish, as though he were writing something his grandson would never actually read. Now, sitting exiled in the heat, while cheers erupted, just beyond his reach. The letter felt less like a precaution, and more like a mission. The decision began as a whisper inside him, a stirring he tried to brush aside. Maybe Ethan wouldn't need it. Maybe seeing his grandfather later, holding out a gift and shaking his hand, would be enough. But then he thought of the look on Ethan's face when he scanned the crowd and didn't find him. That flicker of disappointment. That unspoken question, why wasn't Grandpa there? That thought carved into James deeper than the ache in his knees, or the sweat on his brow. He couldn't allow his grandson to think he had chosen absence. Not when presence had defined his life as a grandfather. He leaned forward, cane balanced against his leg, and drew the envelope from his pocket. His fingers trembled slightly, the paper soft at the edges where it had been handled too many times. He turned it over, staring at the neat script of Ethan's name across the front. For a long moment, he simply held it, the weight of his decision pressing down. He was choosing not just to watch from afar, but to speak across the distance. To leave behind something permanent. As the principal's voice echoed faintly from the speakers, announcing honors and awards, James opened the envelope. He unfolded the letter, careful not to smudge the ink, and scanned the words he had already written. They felt both familiar and incomplete. He reached into his breast pocket for a pen he always carried and pressed it against the paper, adding lines in the uneven scroll of an old man whose hands no longer obeyed as smoothly as they once had. You may not see me when you look up today, he wrote slowly, pausing to steady the pen. But know that I am here. I always have been. Every step you take on that stage carries pieces of me, with it the stories I told you, the lessons we learned together, the quiet nights when I reminded you that you were enough. Today, I am proud beyond words. He stopped, catching his breath, and read it again. The words steadied him. They gave shape to the pride swelling in his chest. Pride too vast to be contained by folding chairs or gymnasium walls. Around him, the audience outside stirred as another round of applause roared from within. James ignored it. His eyes stayed fixed on the letter. His heart aligned with every word. The decision was made. This letter would not stay sealed in his pocket. Forgotten. It would reach Ethan's hands before the day ended. A testament that, even when the world placed him outside, his love still found a way in. He folded the paper carefully, slipped it back into the envelope, and pressed it flat against his chest. His decision had brought him peace. He might not sit inside the gym, he might not cheer as Ethan walked across the stage, but his grandson would carry something even greater, a voice on paper that would last longer than applause, stronger than memory. James closed his eyes for a moment, whispering into the warm air, "This is how I'll be there." And with that, the separation lost some of its sting. He had chosen his way forward, not through defiance or bitterness, but through love captured in ink. The paper trembled slightly in James Whitaker's hands. Not from the breeze drifting across the courtyard, but from the tremor that age had woven into his bones. He steadied it against the flat of his cane, pressing the pages firm so the pen could glide. His spectacles slipped lower on his nose, and he nudged them back with a familiar motion, before setting the tip of the pen to the paper once more. Around him, the crowd in the overflow section was half distracted, some watching the screen, some wiping sweat from their brows, others fanning themselves impatiently. James hardly noticed them. The world narrowed to the letter before him, the one thing he could still give to his grandson when presence had been denied. He began at the top, writing slowly, his hand careful, deliberate. To my grandson Ethan, on the day you walked forward, even when I could not. The words steadied him, anchoring his emotions. He paused, staring at the line, letting it settle in his heart. Then he continued, each stroke of the pen carving a piece of his story into permanence. You will remember today for many reasons. The cap and gown, the diploma, the cheers. But I will remember it because of what it means to me to see the boy I once carried on my shoulders become the man who now carries our family's future. You are not just graduating, Ethan, stepping into the world with a name that holds history, sacrifice, and love. His breath caught, and for a moment he lifted his eyes to the screen. The camera panned across the graduates again, blurry but recognizable in their collective hope. He thought he saw Ethan, tall and straight-backed, and the pride swelled so fiercely inside, James had felt as though it might crack his chest. He lowered his gaze again, and pressed the pen to paper. I want you to know that this day is not about grades or certificates. It is about the journey that brought you here. The nights you stayed awake, studying until your eyes burned. The mornings you rose earlier than your friends because you wanted to do just a little better. The setbacks that bruised your spirit but never broke it. And the love that carried you forward, the love of your mother, who worked harder than anyone I've ever known, and the quiet love of your grandfather, who never missed a chance to cheer for you, even from the shadows. The words pulled him deeper into memory. He thought of Anne, his daughter, and how she had raised Ethan with a strength that mirrored his late wife's. He thought of the afternoons spent sitting on the porch while Ethan rode his bike in clumsy circles, tumbling into the grass only to rise again, more determined each time. Those images pressed against him as he wrote, "If I could give you only one lesson today, it would be this. Greatness is not measured by the applause of a crowd, but by the dignity you show when no one is watching. I was not allowed inside the gym today. They said there was no room, but know this: I was here. Every heartbeat, every thought, every ounce of pride I carry belongs to you. And nothing, not doors or walls, can separate me from that." He stopped again, adjusting his glasses, feeling the sting of tears rise. He wasn't a man prone to crying. Life had hardened him, weathered him, but this moment felt sacred. He dabbed the corner of his eye with his handkerchief, then pressed on. One day, you may face your own moments of exclusion. Times when the world tells you that you don't belong, that there isn't room for you. When that happens, remember this: your worth is not decided by the place you are given, but by the place you make for others. Carry dignity into every room, even the ones that close their doors. Carry kindness like a shield, because the world has enough harshness already. And never forget you are loved more fiercely than you will ever fully understand. His hand slowed, the ink pooling slightly where he hesitated. He exhaled, long and steady, then signed the page. "Love always, Grandpa." He slipped the pen into his breast pocket, folded the paper carefully, and placed it back into the envelope. The decision was complete, and now the letter had begun its true life. It would travel where he could not. It would sit in Ethan's hands, his grandson's eyes scanning the words, his heart absorbing them. James pressed the envelope flat against his chest, closing his eyes for a moment. The noise of applause and muffled music carried on, but he was at peace. He could not be inside, but his words would be, and in the end, that was enough. The applause inside the gymnasium rolled on like waves, striking a distant shore. James Whitaker sat steady in his chair beneath the canopy, the envelope heavy against his chest. He had written the first lines, signed his name, sealed his pride in ink, but he wasn't done. A letter to his grandson couldn't stop at sentiment. It had to carry history, the story of service that had shaped not just him, but the entire family. Ethan needed to know where he came from, the sacrifices carved into the Whitaker name. James drew the letter out once more, unfolded it with care, and balanced it on his cane as a makeshift desk. His pen hovered for a long moment before pressing again into the paper. "Ethan, you may not know the full measure of what came before you. You have seen only fragments of photographs on mantles, the medals in dusty boxes, the cane I carry. But these are not trinkets. They are reminders of service, of choices made long before you were born that still echo in your life today." He paused, hearing his own father's voice in memory, stern and steady, urging him toward duty when the draft notice came. James had been barely more than a boy himself, yet he had answered without hesitation. Not because he longed for glory, but because service was what Whitakers did. It was woven into their bones like marrow. "When I was your age, the world asked something of me," James continued to write. "I left home for places I had never heard of, carrying more fear than courage. But I went because it was required. I learned then that service is not about medals or uniforms. It is about sacrifice. It is about standing firm when everything in you wants to run. It is about giving so that others may have." He stopped to steady his hand, the tremor more noticeable now. He glanced at the screen, its image flickering as rows of students shifted in their seats. He thought of Ethan sitting among them, unaware of the depth of the legacy pressing forward into his own life. "When I came home, I did not bring riches or renown. I brought scars, some you can see, many you cannot. But I also brought determination. I worked long hours in a factory, sweat pouring into steel and iron, so that your mother could have what she needed. I missed birthdays. holidays, and sleep. But I did it willingly. Service did not end with a uniform. It continued in work, in sacrifice, in family. The pen scratched across the page, and James felt the words dig into him as much as the paper. You are the fruit of that service. Ethan, every book you read, every meal you ate, every roof over your head, those came from choices made long before you understood them. I do not tell you this for thanks. I tell you because you must know. Service is the thread that binds us. And one day, the world will ask something of you, too. When it does, I pray you answer, not with fear, but with the quiet courage that comes from knowing you do not stand alone. A breeze tugged at the edge of the page, and James pressed it down with his palm. His mind drifted to nights when Ethan was small, asleep in the back seat after a long day, his tiny hands curled into fists of innocence. James had driven carefully then, not wanting to disturb him, guarding him as fiercely as a soldier on watch. That, too, had been service, small, unnoticed, but sacred. Remember this, he wrote, his pen slowing with weight. Service is not always grand. Sometimes it is working through pain to provide for your family. Sometimes it is listening when others turn away. Sometimes it is showing up, even if they make you sit outside. Do not measure your worth by applause, Ethan. Measure it by the lives you touch. Quietly, consistently, without asking anything in return. The page neared its end. James signed again at the bottom, a simple mark of love and truth. He folded the letter once more, slid it back into its envelope, and pressed it against his heart. The speakers popped, and another surge of applause thundered from inside. James closed his eyes. Though exiled from the gym, he felt nearer to his grandson than ever, bound by the words he had written, by the story of service passed from father to son, grandfather to grandson. This letter, he knew, would carry more than advice. It would carry legacy. And legacy, unlike doors or rules, could never be shut against him. The applause inside the gymnasium rose and fell like a tide, muffled but steady, each cheer reminding James Whitaker that the ceremony pressed forward without him. He sat beneath the canopy, letter resting against his cane, pen still warm from the words he had just written. The story of service had been told, carved into paper for his grandson to carry. But service alone wasn't the whole of it. A life was not just defined by what you gave away, but also by the lessons you held close and passed down. James leaned forward, drew the envelope from his pocket once again, and unfolded the letter. His hand shook faintly, but the determination behind it held firm. The pen scratched against the page, pulling new words into being. Ethan, I have told you about service. Now I must tell you about the lessons it carved into me. They are not complicated, in fact, they are simple. But simple truths are often the hardest to live by. He paused, collecting his thoughts. Lessons had not come to him neatly packaged. They had been taught through hardship, through mistakes, through nights that left him weary, and mornings that demanded more than he thought he could give. He had earned them like scars. First, he wrote, kindness is not weakness. When I was young, I thought being strong meant standing taller than the rest, keeping my chin up no matter what. But I learned that true strength is kneeling beside someone who has fallen, even if the world tells you to keep walking. It is holding your temper when others lose theirs. It is forgiving when pride begs you not to. Do not let anyone tell you that kindness makes you soft. It makes you unbreakable. The pen lingered at the end of the sentence, his thoughts drifting. He remembered nights in the factory, co-workers snapping under pressure, tempers flaring over machines that refused to cooperate. He had been the one to step in, to calm, to steady. Not because it was easy, but because anger solved nothing. Kindness, patience, those had carried him further than fists ever could. He pressed on. Second, dignity is not given. It is chosen. There will be times when the world tries to strip it from you. Today is such a time for me. I was told there was no room for me inside, that my presence was less important than numbers on a page. But dignity means sitting here anyway, shoulders straight, knowing who I am and who I love. It means refusing to let bitterness define you. Ethan, never let anyone decide your worth for you. That is yours to claim, and yours to defend. The words weighed heavy on him. He tapped the cane gently against the ground, as if the rhythm might help him breathe easier. Dignity. It had carried him through war, through loss, through years of labor. It carried him still, even here in the courtyard, denied entry to his grandson's triumph. He wrote again, the ink flowing like confession. Third, courage does not always roar. Sometimes it is quiet, steady, almost invisible. It is found in choosing what is right when no one else is looking, in standing up for someone who cannot stand for themselves, in telling the truth, even when it costs you. Courage is not always about fighting battles. Sometimes it is about enduring them. His eyes lifted briefly to the screen, where rows of black gowns filled the frame. The camera zoomed slightly, and he thought just for an instant he saw Ethan's face. The sight steadied him, gave strength to his final lesson. And last, love is the only thing worth carrying to the end. Not wealth, not recognition. Love, the kind that shows up when it is inconvenient, that waits in the shadows if it must, that sacrifices quietly without demand. Love is the inheritance I leave you, Ethan. Everything else is temporary. Love remains. He sat back, the pen slipping from his hand, the page full. His heart beat hard against his ribs, not with anger or bitterness, but with the release of truth. These lessons were his legacy, carved not in stone but in words his grandson would hold long after this day had ended. Folding the letter once again, James slid it back into the envelope, then pressed it to his chest. His lips moved in a silent prayer that Ethan would carry these lessons further than he ever could, that they would root themselves in his grandson's heart and blossom into a life well lived. The crowd inside erupted in another cheer, rattling the windows of the gym. James closed his eyes, his chin lifting slightly, as if he could see past the brick walls into the future itself. Lessons learned, lessons given. Now, they belonged to Ethan. The envelope now held more than just ink. It carried James Whitaker's heart, his service, his lessons, his love. Still, something weighed heavy inside him, something that hadn't yet been put to paper. He had told Ethan of courage, of kindness, of dignity, but he hadn't said the thing that pressed hardest against his chest. He was sorry. He drew the letter out once more. The paper worn soft at the folds. His hand trembled, but the tremor wasn't from age this time. It was from the ache of a truth he didn't want to leave unspoken. He set the page against his cane again and pressed the pen to the corner. Ethan, before I tell you anything more, I must give you an apology. He paused, exhaling slowly as he searched for the right words. An apology wasn't easy for him. He was a man of action, a man who believed showing up was worth more than saying the right thing. But today, stripped of his rightful seat in the gymnasium, words were all he had left. I am sorry that I was not inside the room when you walked across that stage. I am sorry that when you looked for me in the crowd, your eyes could not find me. I am sorry that the cheers you heard did not include mine, though my heart shouted louder than all of them combined. His hands stilled. He remembered all the moments. He had promised himself he would never miss Ethan's Little League games, his spelling bees, his first piano recital. He had kept those promises, no matter how tired he was from work or how heavy his legs felt. He had always been there. And now, at the moment that mattered most, a rope and a rule had pushed him aside. That failure wasn't his fault, but he bore it all the same. He continued writing. I need you to understand, Ethan, that my absence inside was not a choice. I came early. I wore my best suit. I carried the cane your great-grandfather once leaned on, thinking it would carry me to my seat with dignity. I had my ticket in hand. Still, they told me there was no room. They asked me to sit outside, and I obeyed, because anger would not have honored you. But in that moment, my heart broke. Not for myself, but for you, for the look you might wear when you searched for me and did not see me there. A tear slid, unbidden, down James's cheek, tracing the deep lines time had carved there. He dabbed it with his handkerchief, then pressed on. I am sorry you may have felt alone, even for a moment. I am sorry that the picture you carry of this day might be missing the face you wanted to find. But let me tell you the truth, my boy. Though I was outside those doors, I was never absent. Every breath I took was for you. Every cheer inside the gym, I echoed in my chest. Every time your name was spoken, I whispered it to the wind, certain it would reach you somehow. He stopped again, staring at the words, the ink still wet. He knew Ethan would not blame him. The boy had inherited his mother's forgiving heart, but James needed this apology to live on paper, so that Ethan could know without question that his grandfather's absence had wounded him too. You may hear from others that I wasn't there. Let them say what they will. The truth is written. Here, I was with you. My pride does not need a chair in a gymnasium to exist. My love does not require walls to echo. Still, I am sorry you could not see me with your eyes. I pray you felt me with your heart. The pen slipped from his fingers, clattering softly against the pavement. James closed his eyes, the sound of applause swelling again from the gym. He breathed deep, steadying himself. The apology was written, carved into permanence. It was not weakness to say he was sorry, it was love. He folded the letter carefully, slid it back into the envelope, and pressed it to his chest once more. For the first time that morning, the weight in his heart eased. The apology had been spoken, and in speaking it, he had found peace. The canopy rattled lightly in the breeze as James Whitaker sat with the letter pressed against his chest. He had confessed his pride, told the story of service, shared the lessons he'd learned, and even offered an apology. But he knew something was missing still. An apology alone could leave a shadow. What his grandson needed was perspective, a way to see the world differently than most, a compass that pointed toward something higher than applause or recognition. He opened the envelope again, the creases soft from so much folding, and smoothed the paper against his cane. The pen trembled in his hand, but his resolve had never been steadier. He began to write. Ethan, you are about to enter a world that will measure you by many things: your grades, your career, the car you drive, the house you own. People will look at those markers and decide if you are successful. But I want you to understand something most men take a lifetime to learn. None of that is the true measure. Success is not about the seat you are given in life. It is about the people you choose to lift as you walk. The words steadied him. He could almost hear his father's voice woven into his own, echoing the wisdom passed down through generations. He thought of his wife, Margaret, how she had lived by that truth, every day offering casseroles to grieving neighbors, knitting blankets for babies she'd never meet, listening to stories no one else had the patience to hear. She had lifted people quietly, and in doing so, she had built a legacy stronger than money or titles. I was made to sit outside today, James continued, but I still count myself blessed. Why? Because I had a chance to learn again what really matters. It is not where you sit. It is who you stand beside. Inside the gym, there were cheers and flowers. Out here, there were grumbles and heat. But in both places, there were people's souls with their own burdens, their own joys, their own stories. If you want to know what greatness looks like, it is not walking across a stage to applause. It is stopping to notice the person beside you and making their burden lighter. He remembered a night long ago, working a double shift at the factory. A young man, new to the line, had nearly collapsed from exhaustion. Others had mocked him, but James had stepped forward, taken on half the load, and walked him through the job until he found his footing. That man had written him a letter years later, saying it changed the course of his life. No audience had cheered then, but it had mattered more than any applause could. Perspective is this, James wrote firmly. The world will try to convince you that your worth comes from what you hold in your hands, but your worth truly comes from what you give away. Time, patience, mercy. Those are the treasures that cannot be taken from you. They do not rust, they do not fade, and they cannot be locked behind a door as I was today. The pen hovered for a moment as James looked up at the screen. Another name was called. Another student walked across the stage. He imagined Ethan there, tall and steady, diploma in hand. Pride swelled again, fierce and overwhelming. Yet he knew even that diploma, as important as it was only a symbol. The real victory lay in how Ethan would choose to use it to build, to heal, to serve. Ethan, he wrote slowly, I hope you will chase dreams. I hope you will find work that fulfills you. But above all, I hope you will use every success as a ladder for someone else. Lift people higher. That is what makes a life worth remembering. That is what your grandmother did. That is what I have tried to do. And that is what I pray you will carry forward. His hand trembled harder now, the ink thick where the pen lingered too long. He signed the bottom once more, folded the page carefully, and slipped it back into the envelope. He pressed it to his lips, whispering a silent blessing before tucking it into his jacket. Around him, the crowd stirred as the ceremony neared its climax. The air buzzed with anticipation. James sat tall, shoulders squared, his eyes steady on the screen. The gift of perspective had been given. His grandson might not see him inside the gym, but he would feel him in every word that letter carried. For the first time all morning, James felt no bitterness, only peace. The voices inside the gymnasium surged once more. Another round of names called. Another chorus of cheers rattling the windows. James Whitaker shifted in his chair beneath the canopy. His cane balanced across his knees, his fingers drumming absently against the smooth wood. He had written about service, about lessons, about perspective. But as the ceremony drew closer to its heart, James felt there was one final piece his letter needed before Ethan could truly understand. Not advice, not apology, something more enduring. A promise. A pledge. He drew the letter out again, unfolding it with care, smoothing the creases as though preparing sacred ground. The pen sat heavy in his hand, yet his resolve was light. He pressed the tip to the page and began. Ethan, I have told you of the past. I have given you the lessons that carried me this far. Now I want to speak of what lies ahead, and I want to leave you with a pledge that will not break, no matter where life takes you. The words flowed easily now, as though waiting all morning for this moment. James's mind drifted through the possible futures of his grandson, college dorm rooms, first jobs, maybe marriage, maybe children of his own. With each picture came a certainty. His presence would not always be possible, but his loyalty could endure beyond absence. I pledge to you, he wrote carefully, that no matter the road you walk, you will never walk it alone. Whether you find yourself in a crowded city or a quiet town, whether you rise to great heights or stumble into hard valleys, know that my love goes with you. It is not bound by distance, nor limited by time. It will outlast even me. He paused, lifting his eyes to the flickering screen. The image zoomed on a row of graduates, the camera cutting quickly from one to another. For an instant, James thought he spotted Ethan's profile, the slope of his shoulders, the way his head tilted slightly when he listened. His heart leaped. Pride surged, so powerful it felt like a tide pushing against his ribs. He pressed his pen back to the page, the emotion guiding him. I pledge to be your witness, even in silence. When you succeed, I will be cheering, whether you hear me or not. When you falter, I will be near, reminding you that no stumble defines you. When you feel alone, I will be the voice in your memory saying, stand tall, son. You were made for this. The cane rattled softly as James shifted, his knees aching from the long sit. He leaned forward, steadying the page against the wood. His eyes blurred with tears, but he did not stop. You carry the Whitaker name, and with it comes a history of men and women who served, who endured, who loved fiercely. My pledge to you is that the thread will not break here. Even when I am gone, the bond between us will not end. Because love does not end. It becomes legacy, and legacy lives on in you. His hand trembled harder, the ink blotting slightly at the curve of a letter. He didn't care. The imperfections made it real, made it his. So wherever you go, into classrooms, into battlefields, into boardrooms, into living rooms, I will be with you. You may not see me in the crowd. You may not hear my voice, but you will feel my presence, as sure as you feel the ground beneath your feet. This is my pledge. You will never be without me. He signed the bottom once more, his name written slower this time. The letters sprawling but resolute. Grandpa. Folding the page, he slipped it back into the envelope and pressed it against his chest. He whispered softly into the warm air, that's my promise, boy. That's what I leave you. The ceremony inside swelled again, louder than ever. James lifted his head, shoulders squared, eyes steady on the screen. He could not be there in body, but he had bound himself to his grandson with something stronger than presence. A pledge, etched in ink and love. And in that moment, James felt a calm settle over him, a peace that no locked door or crowded gym could steal. He had spoken his vow. He had secured his legacy. The ceremony inside the gymnasium had reached its peak now. The muffled applause rattled the very windows. The brass band straining through the static speakers outside, filling the courtyard with fragments of triumph. James Whitaker sat quietly, the envelope once more in his lap, his cane balanced across his knees. He had poured himself into the pages, his service, his lessons, his apology, his pledge, but every letter, every word, needed an anchor, something final, something Ethan could hold onto when time thinned the edges of memory. It was time to sign. He drew out the letter again, unfolding it carefully, smoothing the creases against the curve of his cane. His pen hovered above the paper, and he felt the weight of the moment pressing into his hand. A signature was more than ink. It was identity. It was his way of saying, this was me. I was here. I loved you. With all the years I have lived, with all the strength I still carry, and with all the love that remains in me. He wrote slowly, deliberately. I sign this letter as yours forever. His hand shook harder now, and he stopped to steady it against the cane. He took a deep breath, recalling how his father had signed his own letters during the war. Strong, clean strokes, even when the paper was damp and the world was collapsing around him. James tried to channel that steadiness, that dignity. He pressed the pen to the paper once more and scrawled his name with a deliberate care that made his heart ache. James Whitaker. Beneath it, almost without thinking, he added the word he had always used when Ethan was small. Grandpa, the letters leaned unevenly, but they carried his soul. He set the pen down and stared at it, his vision blurring. The signature wasn't just a name, it was a legacy. It was proof that he had stood, lived, endured, and now left something behind. But he wanted more than ink. Ink could fade. Paper could yellow. He reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a small, worn photograph. The corners were curled, the colors fading, but the image remained clear. Ethan, no older than 5, sitting on James's lap, both of them laughing at something just outside the frame. Margaret had taken that picture. James had carried it in his wallet for years, pulling it out on long breaks at the factory, or during quiet nights when the house felt too empty. It was his reminder that life, no matter how hard, still offered joy worth clinging to. He slipped the photo into the envelope with a letter. "That's for you, boy," he whispered, his voice trembling. "So you'll always remember the start of us." His hand brushed the inside pocket of his jacket once more, where the gift bag with the watch rested. He hesitated, then smiled faintly. The watch would be given in person, a token for the world to see. But this letter, sealed with his name and that photograph, was something else entirely, a private inheritance. A treasure that would outlive trinkets. James folded the letter carefully, slid it into the envelope, and pressed the seal shut with his thumb. Then, with a quiet gravity, he lifted it to his lips and kissed it once. It was the final act, the way Margaret used to seal birthday cards for Anne when she was little. A kiss, a blessing, a piece of love pressed into paper. He tucked the envelope back into his jacket pocket, close to his heart, and sat straighter in his chair. The sun beat down hot, sweat tracing lines across his brow, but he felt a coolness, inside, a calmness he hadn't known since being turned away at the gym doors. The letter was done, signed, complete. Inside, another roar of applause rose, shaking the courtyard. James lifted his head, eyes on the flickering screen. He thought he saw Ethan standing now, cap tilted slightly, his diploma in hand. The sight was blurry, washed in sunlight, but James's heart recognized it instantly. He smiled, not with bitterness this time, but with peace. The signature on that letter was more than a name. It was a bridge, connecting generations, carrying his voice forward long after silence claimed him. It was his way of saying, "I was here. I loved you. I always will." The ceremony inside the gymnasium thundered toward its conclusion. Through the distorted speakers outside, James Whitaker caught the swell of music as the graduates prepared to toss their caps. Families around him shifted, some standing to gather their belongings, others leaning forward to catch the last names called. The canopy fluttered gently in the breeze, but James hardly noticed. His eyes were fixed on the envelope pressed against his chest. The letter was finished, now signed, sealed, and blessed with a kiss. But what good were words if they never reached the one who needed them? James knew he couldn't simply slip the letter back into a drawer at home, hidden like a relic. It had to find Ethan today. On this very day, the boy needed to read it while the weight of graduation was still fresh, before life swept him into its rushing current. He shifted in his chair, the ache in his knees sharper now from sitting so long. With a grunt, he rose, balancing on his cane. Around him, families gathered their children, chatter filling the courtyard as the gym doors creaked open. Graduates poured out in a rush of black gowns and tassels, laughter spilling into the sunlight. Parents surged forward with flowers, cameras flashing, hugs smothering. James held back, standing tall, though the cane trembled slightly beneath his grip. His eyes searched the crowd for Ethan's face, scanning every tall figure in a cap and gown. For a moment, the sea of youth overwhelmed him, and doubt pricked his chest. He might not find the boy in this chaos. He might leave without delivering the words that had cost him so much of his heart. Then he saw him. Ethan emerged from the gym doors, cap askew, diploma clutched in one hand. His smile was wide, his laughter bright as classmates slapped him on the back. James's throat tightened. At the sight, the boy had grown taller than he remembered, his shoulders broader, his stride confident. Yet in his eyes, though they were scanning the crowd, searching, James still saw the child who had once clung to his hand, the boy who had whispered, "Don't let go, Grandpa." James's chest ached. He wanted to call out, to wave his cane, to push through the crowd, but his voice felt too small against the roar of families, and his legs too unsteady for the rush. He stood rooted, the envelope clutched tightly, praying for another way. That was when a young man brushed past him, a graduate with his cap tucked under his arm. His face was flushed from the heat, His steps hurried toward the parking lot. James reached out gently, touching his sleeve. The boy turned, surprised. "Son," James said softly, his voice steady despite the trembling in his hands. "Would you do me a favor?" The graduate blinked, then nodded. "Sure, sir." James held out the envelope, his fingers reluctant to let go. "Find Ethan Whitaker. He's about your height, dark hair, just walked out with his diploma. Hand him this. Tell him it's from his grandfather." The young man looked at him, then at the envelope, then back again. Something softened in his expression. He accepted the letter carefully, tucking it against his gown as though it were fragile. "I'll make sure he gets it," he promised. James's eyes stung with gratitude. "Thank you, son," he murmured, voice thick. "You'll never know what this means." The boy gave him a small nod and disappeared into the crowd. James stood still, cane pressed against the pavement, watching as the graduate wove his way toward Ethan. He couldn't hear the exchange, couldn't see Ethan's reaction, but he trusted. He trusted the kindness of a stranger. He trusted the strength of the letter. He trusted love to carry the rest. Around him, families embraced. Caps flew into the air. Cameras snapped. James didn't raise his voice or step forward. He simply stood tall, shoulders squared, as though standing guard. Over the moment, he had delivered the letter not with his own hands, but with his own resolve. For the first time that day, peace settled deep in his bones. He had found a way in, even when the doors had closed him out. The words would reach his grandson. The truth would be known. And that, he realized, was enough. The Whitaker house was quieter than usual that evening. Streamers and balloons still clung to the porch rail, the remnants of Anne's small graduation gathering for family and neighbors. The laughter and chatter had long since faded. The plates cleared, the cake reduced to crumbs. In his room upstairs, Ethan Whitaker hung his gown carefully over the back of his chair. The tassel brushed against the wood, swaying gently as though waving goodbye to the day. He loosened his tie, kicked off his shoes, and collapsed onto the bed with a sigh that was half exhaustion, half awe. He reached into the pocket of the gown, fingers brushing against something stiff. Curious, he pulled it out, a plain white envelope, his name written on the front in familiar, steady handwriting. For a moment, his breath caught. He recognized the script instantly. His grandfather's. Ethan sat up slowly, the noise of the day replaying in his head. The chaos outside the gym, the hugs from friends, the endless pictures. He remembered scanning the crowd after receiving his diploma, searching for the tall, silver-haired man with the cane, the one who had promised he wouldn't miss this. He hadn't seen him. For a fleeting moment, disappointment had burned in his chest. But now this envelope. He turned it over carefully, as though it might crumble in his hands. The seal had been pressed firmly shut, but he slipped his thumb beneath the flap and opened it with care. Inside was a folded letter, thick with words. A photograph slipped free and landed on his lap, himself at 5 years old, grinning on his grandfather's knee, both of them laughing at something out of frame. Ethan smiled faintly, his eyes stinging. He set the photo aside and unfolded the pages. The first line caught him immediately. "To my grandson, Ethan, on the day you walked forward, even when I could not." His throat tightened. He read on, eyes moving slowly over each line, his grandfather's voice rising from the page as if he was sitting beside him. He read about service, about nights in factories, about sacrifices made quietly so his mother could thrive. He read about kindness, dignity, courage, and love. Each word landed heavy, not like a lecture, but like a gift, something carefully wrapped, offered with tenderness. Halfway through, he paused, wiping his eyes. The ink blurred slightly where his tears had fallen. He set the paper down, staring at the photograph again, the boy he once was, the man he was becoming. His grandfather had always been there at baseball games, at birthdays, at late-night talks, when the world felt too big, and yet, he hadn't been inside the gym today. Ethan had wondered why. Now he knew. He picked a letter back up, turning to the section that began, "I am sorry." He read the apology slowly, each word carving into him. His grandfather had been outside, turned away, left in the heat while others cheered. He had been there, but unseen. The realization burned through Ethan, a mix of sorrow and pride. Sorrow that his grandfather had been denied the place he deserved. Pride that he had endured it with grace, writing instead of raging, loving instead of resenting. Then came the pledge. Ethan's breath hitched as he read, "I pledge to be your witness, even in silence. You will never be without me." He pressed the paper to his chest, the words searing into him like a brand. The ache he had carried, the fear that his grandfather had missed it, was replaced by something deeper. He hadn't missed it at all. He had simply chosen a different way to be present. Ethan finished the letter, his eyes wet, his heart pounding. When he reached the signature, James Whitaker, Grandpa, he let out a shaky breath and whispered, "I love you too." He sat for a long while in silence, the room lit only by the glow of his desk lamp. Outside, crickets sang, and the night air pressed cool against the window. Ethan read the letter again, slower this time, letting each word settle into him. It wasn't just advice. It was a map, a compass, a promise. Finally, he folded the paper carefully, slipped it back into the envelope, and placed the photograph on his nightstand. He looked at the picture one last time before turning off the lamp. The boy on his grandfather's knee, laughing. The man on the porch with the cane, waiting, and him, now, caught between. The discovery wasn't just of a letter. It was of a legacy. A reminder that no matter where life carried him, he would never walk alone. Ethan Whitaker didn't sleep much that night. The letter sat on his nightstand, unfolded and refolded so many times, the creases had begun to weaken. Every time he closed his eyes, his grandfather's words surfaced again, as if the paper itself carried a heartbeat. Kindness is not weakness. Dignity is chosen. Courage is quiet. Love endures. The lessons echoed like a steady drum, reshaping something inside him. When dawn broke, pale light spilling across the floorboards, Ethan was already awake, sitting on the edge of his bed with the letter in his hands. His cap and gown lay folded neatly over the chair, the tassel glinting faintly. For the first time since the ceremony, he allowed himself to feel the full weight of what had happened. His grandfather had been there. Not inside, not cheering from the bleachers, but there in spirit. Enduring humiliation and heat, so Ethan could still carry pride. And instead of bitterness, he had left a letter filled with love. That truth struck Ethan harder than any speech he'd heard from the principal or the superintendent. His grandfather hadn't shouted or protested loudly. He had chosen the harder way, quiet endurance. And in doing so, he had given Ethan a gift, greater than applause. Perspective. Downstairs, the house was still, his mother asleep after hosting family well into the night. Ethan carried the letter carefully into the kitchen and set it on the table, staring at it as he poured himself a glass of water. He imagined his grandfather sitting in that same spot, pen in hand, the lamplight glowing across his face as he wrote. He wondered if tears had fallen then too, the way they had when Ethan read the words. The impact of the letter grew larger the longer he thought about it. His grandfather hadn't written as a man seeking thanks. He had written as a man leaving a legacy, a blueprint for how to live not just with success, but with honor. Ethan realized that graduation wasn't just about receiving a diploma. It was about receiving responsibility, and his grandfather had handed him that responsibility in the form of ink and paper. Later that morning, Ethan dressed not in his cap and gown, but in jeans and a plain shirt. He folded the letter once more, slipped it into his pocket, and drove across town. The streets were quiet, dew still clinging to the grass, the kind of morning where the world seemed fresh, expectant. His heart pounded as he turned down the familiar street that led to his grandfather's small house. James was there, of course, sitting on the porch in his favorite chair, cane leaning against the railing. He looked smaller somehow, framed against the morning light, but his presence filled the space. When he saw Ethan step out of the car, his lips curved into the faintest of smiles, the kind that carried more meaning than words. Ethan crossed the yard quickly, the letter burning in his pocket. For a moment, he didn't know what to say. The silence stretched, broken only by birdsong. Finally, he pulled the envelope free and held it up. "I read it," he said, simply. His voice cracked, but he didn't care. Every word. James's eyes softened. He tapped his cane lightly against the porch, a rhythm of acknowledgement. And Ethan swallowed hard. "And it changed me." His throat tightened, but he pressed on. "You weren't in the gym, Grandpa, but you were there in the way that mattered most. I felt you in every word." The old man's gaze held steady, a sheen of moisture at the corners of his eyes. He didn't speak right away. Instead, he opened his arms, and Ethan stepped into them, bending to embrace the man who had carried him through so much of life. The cane clattered softly against the porch. Forgotten for the moment, in that embrace, Ethan felt the full impact of the letter settle into his bones. It wasn't just a message for one day. It was a guide for the rest of his life. He knew then that whenever the world measured him by shallow markers, he would remember his grandfather's words. He would choose kindness over cruelty, dignity over shame, quiet courage over noise. and love above all else. When they finally pulled apart, James chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Well," he murmured, "sounds like you got the diploma, but I got the honor." Ethan laughed through the tears in his eyes. "No, Grandpa," he said firmly. "We both did." And in that moment, under the rising sun, the letter's true impact became clear. It wasn't just a note passed through a crowd, it was a torch, handed from one generation to the next, burning steady and bright dot. By late afternoon, the small town of Mason was alive with celebration. Cars honked as graduates paraded down Main Street, their caps dangling from rearview mirrors, their laughter spilling into the air. Neighbors waved from porches, clapping and cheering as though each student were their own. Yet while the town buzzed with festivity, Ethan Whitaker had only one destination in mind. He had promised himself during the long, sleepless night that he would not let the day close without giving his grandfather a moment worthy of his sacrifices. The letter had shown him the depth of what James endured sitting outside in the heat, barred from the very moment he had waited his whole life to witness. Ethan would not let that be the final word, so he dressed once more in his gown, straightened the tassel, and tucked his diploma under his arm. He drove across town with deliberate care, heart pounding as if this were another ceremony entirely. The closer he drew to his grandfather's street, the heavier the weight of the moment pressed upon him. James was there, as Ethan knew he would be, seated on the porch in his weathered chair, Kane leaning at his side. The afternoon sun slanted low, gilding his silver hair in light. He looked tired, the long day evident in the slump of his shoulders. But when his eyes caught sight of Ethan stepping from the car, something in him lifted, his back straightened, his chin rose, and his eyes glistened. Ethan walked across the yard, the grass crunching beneath his shoes, his diploma clutched firmly. He didn't speak right away. Instead, he climbed the porch steps slowly, every movement deliberate, heavy with meaning. When he reached his grandfather, he stopped, holding the diploma out with both hands. "We did it, Grandpa," Ethan said softly. The words carried more weight than the diploma itself. James stared at it for a long moment, his lips trembling, his eyes filling. Slowly, with hands that shook more from emotion than age, he reached out and accepted it. His fingers brushed the ribbon, the seal, and then lingered over his grandson's name, etched in bold letters. For a moment, silence filled the porch. The town's celebration was just a distant hum, the laughter of neighbors a world away. Here, it was only the two of them, the old man with a cane, and the young man with a future bound together by something deeper than ceremony. James cleared his throat, his voice rough. "You carried us across that stage, Ethan. All of you, Mother, your grandmother, even me. I may have been outside those doors, but you carried me with you." Ethan shook his head. "No, Grandpa, you carried me. Every late night you stayed with me, every story you told, every lesson you taught. You were there long before that stage, and you'll be with me long after." The words broke something in James. A tear rolled down his cheek, carving through the lines of his face. He didn't wipe it away. Instead, he pulled Ethan closer with one arm, the diploma still pressed between them. For a long moment, they stayed like that grandfather and grandson. Two generations joined by love and legacy. When they finally pulled apart, James chuckled, his voice softer than usual. "You know, when I was your age, I thought a diploma was the greatest thing I'd ever hold. But this," he tapped the rolled parchment, then placed his hand over Ethan's heart, "this is greater. Seeing the man you've become." Ethan swallowed hard, unable to speak, but the letter in his pocket said it all. He didn't need to repeat the words his grandfather had written. They were already carved into him. As the sun dipped lower, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, James handed the diploma back. "This belongs in your hands, son. But know that it belongs to me too in spirit, if not in paper." Ethan accepted it, his grip firm, his resolve stronger than it had ever been. "Then we'll share it," he said. "It's ours." The old man smiled, a tired but radiant smile, and leaned back in his chair. Ethan sat beside him on the porch steps, gown pooling around him, diploma across his lap. Together, they watched the neighborhood children chase fireflies, the laughter of youth mixing with the quiet dignity of age. In that simple stillness, more powerful than any ceremony, the reunion was complete, not in a gymnasium filled with noise, but on a porch filled with love. Evening settled slowly over Mason, the sky painted in hues of lavender and gold. The town's celebrations faded into a distant hum music, drifting from open windows, laughter echoing faintly down neighborhood streets. But on James Whitaker's porch, The world was still. Grandfather and grandson sat side by side, one in a weathered chair, the other on the porch steps, the rolled diploma resting across Ethan's lap. The air smelled faintly of honeysuckle and cut grass, a summer night wrapping around them like a blanket. For a while, neither spoke. They didn't need to. The silence was not heavy but full, carrying with it the weight of everything that had already been said in ink, in hugs, in tears. James leaned lightly on his cane, his body tired, but his spirit alight. Ethan leaned forward on his knees, staring out at the fireflies sparking to life across the yard. His grandfather's words replaying again and again in his mind. At last, Ethan broke the silence. "Grandpa," he said softly, "I don't think I'll ever forget that letter. Not today. Not 10 years from now. Not 50. James turned his head slowly, his silver hair glowing faintly in the porch light. His eyes were tired but sharp, steady as ever. "Good," he said. "It wasn't meant to be forgotten. It was meant to carry you when I can't." The words landed heavy, and Ethan's chest tightened. He didn't like to think of a world without his grandfather. The cane leaning against the chair, the soft tremor in his hands. The lines carved deep into his face, all reminders that time was running short. But tonight, there was no grief in it. There was only gratitude, the knowledge that love could outlive even time itself. Ethan pulled the envelope from his pocket, unfolded the letter once more, and set it carefully across his lap beside the diploma. The paper fluttered slightly in the breeze, the inked words glowing faintly under the porch light. He traced a finger along the signature James Whitaker. Grandpa felt the strength of it seep into him. "You gave me more than advice," he whispered. "You gave me a compass." James smiled faintly, his eyes glistening. "That's all any of us can hope to give. Not answers, just direction. You'll have to walk the road yourself, Ethan. But now you'll know where true north is." The old man leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly, almost as if laying down a burden he had carried for years. "I worried, you know, that I'd leave this world without passing along what mattered. That the things your grandmother and I sacrificed for would fade. But tonight," his voice cracked, and he steadied it with effort. "Tonight I see it won't." Ethan turned to him, his voice firm. "It won't, Grandpa. I'll carry it. All of it. Your lessons, your service, your love. And one day, when I have children, or grandchildren, I'll give it to them too." The words lit something in James's eyes, a fire that chased away the years for just a moment. He reached out, his hand trembling as it rested on Ethan's shoulder. "That's the legacy, boy. Not medals, not diplomas, not even letters. It's love passed on, generation to generation. If you do that, you'll have lived well." The night deepened. Crickets sang. A cool breeze swept the porch. They sat together until the stars pricked the sky. The letter and the diploma side by side, symbols of past and future, bound by the present moment. Finally, James closed his eyes, a smile lingering on his lips. "You made me proud today, Ethan. More proud than I thought a man could be. And when my time comes, I'll leave knowing I left something worth keeping." Ethan swallowed hard, gripping both the diploma and the letter in his lap. "You'll be with me, Grandpa. Always." The words hung in the air, steady and true. In that moment, the story was no longer about a graduation, or a gymnasium, or even an apology written on paper. It was about legacy, an invisible thread that stretched from James's cane-worn hands to Ethan's strong young shoulders, binding them across time. And under the quiet Georgia sky, both men knew the legacy would endure.